The sun was just a bruised purple smear against the Montana skyline. The kind of morning where the air feels like a cold sheet against your skin and the only sound is the gravel singing under your tires. And I was just minding my own business, heading down Highway 12 in my old beat-up Silverado, thinking about nothing more complicated than a black coffee and a breakfast burrito, when I saw them. Those strobe light flashes of red and blue reflecting off my mirrors, sharp enough to cut through the dawn haze, and my first instinct, the one honed by 20 years in the uniform, was to check my speedometer, even though I knew damn well I was cruising at a steady 55, but then I looked closer at the SUV behind me and realized something was fundamentally wrong with the picture, because that wasn't a Ford Interceptor or a Tahoe. It was a white Suburban with a light bar that looked like it had been bolted on by someone who'd watched too many action movies. And let me tell you, when you've been the sheriff of Custer County as long as I have, you know every bolt and decal on every cruiser in a 100-mile radius. So I pulled over to the shoulder, the dust swirling up around my windows like a ghost, and I sat there for a second with my hands on the wheel, just watching the two guys climbing out of that SUV, noticing how they were wearing these heavy tactical vests with, end quote, HOA enforcement, end quote, plastered across the back in big, blocky white letters, and they were strutting toward me with that specific kind of chest-puffed-out confidence you only see in people who have never actually been in a real fight but desperately want you to think they have. And as the taller one, this wiry guy with a buzz cut and mirrored shades that cost more than his dignity, tapped on my glass with his knuckles. Not a polite tap, mind you, but a hard metallic rap. I realized I wasn't into oppos. Being pulled over by the law. I was being hunted by the Homeowners Association from the Heights. A gated community I'd moved into 6 months ago just to have a quiet place to retire. But apparently, peace and quiet weren't into oppos. Tea on the menu today, because the moment I rolled down that window, the smell of unearned authority hit me harder than the cold morning air. End quote. License, registration, and proof of residency, end quote. The tall one barked, his voice thin but trying for a baritone, while his partner, a shorter, heavier man, clutching a clipboard like it was the Ten Commandments, started circling my truck, scribbling notes, and shaking his head with this performative disappointment that made my skin crawl. So I just leaned back in my seat, letting out a long, slow breath. And I asked him as calmly as a man can when he and oppos, being accosted on a state highway, end quote. Son, do you have any idea whose jurisdiction you and oppos re-standing in right now, end quote. And he didn't oppos to even blink, just tapped his tactical vest and told me that under Article 4, Section 12 of the Community Oversight Act, they were authorized to conduct an oppos, compliance intercepts and oppos, for any resident whose behavior or property threatened the aesthetic integrity of the Heights. And he pointed a gloved finger at my truck, specifically at the rusted toolbox in the back and the mud-caked wheel wells, calling it and oppos, visual pollutant and oppos, that I've been warned about 3 times via certified mail, which was news to me since I usually use those HOA newsletters to start fires in my backyard pit, and before I could even point out that we were currently 3 miles outside the neighborhood gates on a road maintained by the state of Montana. A silver Lexus pulled up behind them like the final boss in a very pathetic video game, and out stepped Diane Sterling, the HOA president, a woman who wore pearls like armor and carried a smile that never quite reached her eyes, which were currently narrowed at me with a mix of triumph and pure, unadulterated spite. End quote. Good morning, Jack, end quote. Diane said, her voice dripping with that fake sweetness that makes your teeth ache, end quote. I told you we'd find a way to address this and oppos, situation and oppos, if you continue to ignore our civil requests, and I think it's time we move past warnings and into active enforcement. Don and oppos. To you? End quote. And she gestured to the 2 goons as if they were SEAL Team 6, instead of 2 guys who probably spent their weekends patrolling the community pool for unauthorized pool noodles, and I just shook my head, a small, tired laugh escaping my throat, because I was looking at a woman who genuinely believed that her board member status gave her the right to deputize civilians and run traffic stops on a public thoroughfare. So I told her, and quote, Diane, you're about 10 seconds away from making a mistake you can't walk back from. So why don an oppos? Till you tell your boys to get back in the Suburban and go back to measuring grass heights before this gets ugly, end quote. But she just huffed, clicking her pen against that clipboard, and told the tall guy to Anapos. Proceed with the impoundment procedure in Anapos, because I was being non-compliant, and that's when the tall guy actually reached for his belt, where he had a pair of silver handcuffs that looked like they'd been bought at a novelty shop. And he told me to step out of the vehicle and place my hands on the hood, and in that moment, the air got very still, because these people weren't in Anapos just playing dress-up anymore. They were attempting to unlawfully detain a citizen, and more importantly, they were attempting to do it to the man who actually signed the paycheck for the deputies who patrolled this county. I didn't Anapos get out of the truck, not yet. I just reached down and keyed the mic on my shoulder, a small, discreet piece of equipment they had in Anapos. To even notice because they were too busy admiring their own reflections in my tinted glass. And I gave the 10 to 33 code, officer in distress, along with my coordinates, and I did it with a voice as flat as the horizon because I knew what was coming. But Diane and her Anapos, officers in Anapos, thought I was just cowering, and she leaned in close to my window, the smell of expensive perfume and cheap power tripping filling the cab. And she whispered that once my truck was in the impound lot, I'd have to pay the back fines for my Anapos, unauthorized Anapos, porch swing before I'd ever see it again. And I just looked her dead in the eye and said, and quote, "You know, Diane, I've spent my whole life catching criminals, but I never thought I'd find 3 of them on my way to get a breakfast burrito," end quote. And her face went from smug to confused for just a heartbeat before the sound started. A low, distant wail that grew into a screaming chorus of sirens. 3, maybe 4 cruisers coming from both directions, tires screaming on the asphalt as they boxed in the silver Lexus and the fake Suburban, and the look on the tall guy in Apos' face when my lead deputy, Miller, stepped out of his car with his hand on his holster was something I wish I could have framed and hung on my wall. Because suddenly the Apos, HOA enforcement Apos, team didn't Apos, look so tough. They looked like kids caught with their hands in the cookie jar, except the cookie jar was a felony and the parents had Glocks. Miller didn't Apos to even look at the guys in the vests at first. He just walked straight to my door, saw me sitting there with my hands on the wheel, and he asked, and quote, "Everything all right, Sheriff?" End quote. And the silence that followed those 2 words was so heavy you could have buried a body in it, as Diane's face turned shade of white I've only ever seen on a fresh coat of paint. And the guy with the clipboard actually dropped it into the dirt, the papers fluttering away in the wind like his career prospects, and I finally stepped out of the truck, adjusting my belt and looking down at the 2 Apos, officers in Apos, who were now backing away, their hands hovering awkwardly near their sides, and I told Miller, and quote, "These gentlemen were just explaining the Community Oversight Act to me. Apparently my truck is a visual pollutant, and I'm under arrest for having a toolbox. What do you think about that?" End quote. And Miller, who has a dry sense of humor that I've always appreciated, just looked at their fake badges and said, and quote, "Well, Sheriff, I think I got about 6 different charges for impersonating a peace officer, unlawful detention, and maybe a few counts of reckless endangerment for that illegal light bar. But I'll have to check the book to see if an Apos, being a complete idiot in Apos, is a misdemeanor or a felony these days." End quote. The next hour was a blur of real handcuffs clinking, the heavy industrial kind that actually means something, and Diane Sterling screaming about her rights, and her brother-in-law the judge, and how the HOA was a private entity that could do whatever it wanted, but the law doesn't in Apos. Care about your bylaws when you and Apos, re-standing on state-owned asphalt. And as I watched them load the 2 Apos, officers in Apos, into the back of Miller's car, I walked over to Diane, who was currently being cited for conspiracy to commit a crime, and I told her that this wasn't Apos just about a truck anymore. This was about the fact that she'd turned a neighborhood committee into a paramilitary group because she was bored and had a little bit of power, and I promised her that by the time I was done, the only thing she'd be presiding over was a jail cell bunk bed. And it turns out I'm a man of my word, because once we started digging into the HOA's books after the arrests, we found out Diane had been embezzling funds to pay for those in Apos, tactical vests in Apos, and the Suburban, funneling thousands of dollars into what she called Apos, safety initiative in Apos, that was really just a way for her to bully anyone who didn't in Apos, plant the right kind of petunias, and the whole community, people who had been living in fear of her fines and her and Oppos, compliance stops and Oppos, for years, finally started talking, and the stories that came out were enough to make your stomach turn. Old ladies being threatened with foreclosure over a cracked driveway. Families being hounded because their kids drew in chalk on the sidewalk. And it all came crashing down because she decided to pull over the wrong guy on a Tuesday morning. I ended up moving out of the Heights a month later, not because I had to, but because the air there just felt tainted by the memory of it all. And last I heard, Diane is serving a 3-year stretch for fraud and impersonation, while the Oppos, COA cops and Oppos, are working at a car wash 2 counties over, hopefully without the tactical vest this time. And I still drive that same Silverado with the rusted toolbox and the mud tires. And every time I pass that stretch of Highway 12, I can't help but smile a little bit, because it's a reminder that no matter how much someone puffs out their chest or how many blocky letters they slap on a vest, the real law, ISN and Oppos, T's something you can buy on the internet or enforce with a clipboard. It's something that lives in the truth. And sometimes the truth has a funny way of showing up with sirens and a sheriff who just wanted a breakfast burrito. But now I gotta ask you guys, because I see this kind of thing happening more and more lately, where these small-time organizations think they're the judge, jury, and executioner just because they have a little bit of local authority. So have you ever had an HOA or a local group try to pull something like this on you? Do you think the punishment fit the crime? Or was I too hard on Diane for just trying to end Oppos? Keep the neighborhood nice and Oppos. Drop a comment below, and let's talk about it, because I got a feeling there are a lot more Dianes out there than we realize, and maybe it's time we start talking about where the community rules end and the actual law begins.